Good morning, everyone. My name is Sagi Brody. I'm the CTO of Webair. We're going to go ahead and get the webinar started now. Thank you for joining. This webinar is titled How to Implement a Disaster and Ransomware Recovery Strategy That Actually Works. So this will be a talk which will be technical at times, very technical, and at sometimes high level and non-technical. And the idea is to really go into the weeds for some of the gotchas and issues that you might run into when you're trying to implement a recovery process and strategy and infrastructure that will work when you need it, and also hopefully make you think about some of the non-technical considerations that are sometimes not so apparent. If you're not familiar with Webair, we are a managed infrastructure provider. We've been in business for over 20 years. We're based out of New York. And in addition to providing disaster recovery, on-site backups, and business continuity, we also provide customized and flexible managed infrastructure for production environments, for hybrid cloud, networking, and everything in between. We operate out of the East Coast, West Coast, the mid region in the U.S., as well as in Canada, multiple sites in Europe, and in Asia. And we've been recognized in the industry for sort of being a leader in the disaster recovery space, being a notable vendor in the Magic Quadrant report the last 3 years in Gartner's, as well as other accolades. So in regards to disaster recovery, why should you care? I think this is fairly obvious these days. It's certainly a hot topic in the news. But when you think about disaster recovery, it's more than just the traditional types of physical disasters, the hurricanes, the storms, and the likelihood of you needing it for that type of event is less than the other types of events that people are talking about and what we're seeing. Obviously, human error, infrastructure problems, application problems, software problems. Those are the likely events that cause you to actually need DR, and that's what we see day to day with our customer base. And then there's also security. Obviously, disaster recovery is a ransomware recovery capability. If it's set up properly, if your DR strategy and implementation is done the right way, which we'll show you today, is it going to give you enough confidence to hit the button to fail over in response to a ransomware event, or is it less painful for you to pay the ransom? So we want to get you to a point where you won't ever pay the ransom. Even if it's $500, whatever, you have a recovery capability that is easy to use, failover, failback, and prevents you from doing that. And so a lot of this kind of translates into not just disaster recovery for IT, but really a operational capability, a business capability, which is known as business resilience. And that is the ability to absorb and recover and adapt in a changing environment so that you can keep delivering service. And it's not just about technology. It's about people. It's about procedures. It's about process. It's about changing your thinking from recovering from an event to being always available, and from protecting infrastructure to changing to looking at business outcomes. And so, by way of example, your human capital, your IT staff, can be single points of failure. They can be exposure to your business, just like IT infrastructure is. The decisions you make in the future regarding what SaaS platforms you use, what clouds you use, what vendors you use, those will have a great impact on your resilience capability. If you start using a SaaS platform to take care of a specific software need you have, they might be incompatible with your future IT resilience and business resilience needs. And so what you do in the future for your production environment will affect your recovery capability for your existing legacy and future platforms. Unfortunately, when we think about business continuity and resilience, the software that is sort of the most comes up in people's heads is backup software, and this is not a good thing. Backup software has typically been just enough. It's been a hope and a prayer. It's worked. We hope that it works most of the time, but it is certainly not an IT resilience type of capability. And what we want to do is get our IT organizations out of these middle of the night, over the weekend IT heroics to recover environments sort of like Scotty, and hoping that the backup software works and sitting there waiting for hours for restores, crossing their fingers, to true availability. And so traditional backup software has sort of failed us in this regard. Obviously, there are newer software vendors, but we're not talking really about software here. We're talking about a solution. We're talking about disaster recovery, not just as a piece of software that you buy or hardware that has a capability. It's more than that. It's not just a checkbox on your audit that you need to show that your data is off-site. It has nothing to do with your long-term data backups and archival retention capabilities. It's not about rehydrating those backups. It's true resilience. It's true automated failover, failback. It's applications that perform at production as they did at DR as they did in production. It's not having to make network changes. It's not having to notify the organization. What we're looking for is a truly seamless process. And so if that's what you're after, that's what you want, or at least for part of your environment, because obviously your entire IT stack probably doesn't need that capability. Then you need to consider many different layers of your stack. Yes, copying data from one location to the other is important, but copying data is the easy part. Replicating data in another location, that's super simple today. There's great software tools, there's great backup tools, replication tools that do all that. That's the easy part. It's everything else which makes true DR more complex. What are you doing about your physical servers? What are you doing about your direct storage mounts into your VMs? And what are you doing about the network? How do we seamlessly integrate this? And then what about the operational overhead? Who is owning the failover, the failback, the runbook authoring, and the resilience? And like I just said, this is not an all or nothing sort of thing. And this is, the first thing that you really need to do is to look at your applications, look at all your applications and categorize them. What is your appetite for risk for each app? What can absolutely never go down? What can survive with a 15-minute RPO, 1-hour RTO? What is fine if it comes back with 6 hours? And what might you never need? And backups might be a proper solution. Because based on each one of those categories, there is a different strategy and a solution for each, and you should be running multiple ones concurrently. And so the first thing to really think about is that, are those capabilities? What type of disaster recovery capability are you looking for? Are you strictly looking to protect from an event that would take down one physical location, a site-wide failure, maybe an office building or a data center? If that's what you're after, then the decisions that you make and as far as the software to use, the vendors, the integrations, is going to be much easier and simpler than if you're after a capability which will allow you to fail over specific servers or specific applications. If you're looking for the entire site's down, we need to fail everything over, that's going to be much easier than, hey, we have one VM that got hit with ransomware, which is it's causing one application not to work. We need to fail over that specific application and leave the rest of the production environment intact. It's certainly possible, certainly doable, but requires you to think about many other factors. Some go deeper. Some want a capability that will work as needed on demand so that they can fail over to perform maintenance at production, to do QA or patching at production, and obviously by using it often, now you prove that it works. And some actually will fail between production and DR every 3 months or every 6 months to be in that cadence to show that they have a truly resilient infrastructure that can work properly on both sides. And so each one of those has its own separate list of requirements. Next thing to consider is failback. So now you flipped over, let's say, for any one of those to your DR site. How easy is it to get back? Well, you definitely need a reverse replication capability, and there are some great software tools out there. But what you don't want to do is to deal with it manually and do it manually, because now your failback process might take days or weeks. You also need to consider your bandwidth. You might have had enough bandwidth to do replication from production to DR, but now at your DR site, do you have enough bandwidth to service your outbound users and at the same time deal with the reverse replication back? You might never be able to catch up, bring your data back if you haven't done those calculations and you don't have enough bandwidth. Also consider, what is your appetite for a graceful shutdown? The reverse replication from DR to production might never catch up. And if you want to play it safe, the best way to do it is really to shut down the apps at DR during a controlled maintenance window and fail back. So can you go down for an hour over a weekend to fail back, or is that not in the works, or what is that amount of time? So you can calculate what that looks like and translate it into change rate and bandwidth as well. And then regarding testing, how are you going to test DR? What does that look like? And so the first thing to consider is, how will you consume it? Would you like to set up a room where your application owners go and sit and test your apps at DR? Well, that's cool, because now you can have a dedicated VPN in that location. Anyone walking in that room is always testing the DR site. Maybe it's a VPN that they connect to. Maybe it's a host name change. You certainly do want to pass the testing responsibility out of the IT team and into the hands of the application owners. Why should it be IT's responsibility to attest that an application works the way that it did in production? Only the users will know if there's a problem. They can smell out and root out deep application issues much better, since they're the ones using it day in and day out. They can detect slowness and all that. And what about when you are speaking to third parties? When your application is dependent on integrations with third-party services via API, via webhooks, via databases, how are you able to actually test your application at DR when they're speaking to third parties? And what if they're transacting data? Now you're making a change at DR. It's going into the third party, which is connected back to your production. So that could be tricky. And so you can work with your third party to set up a test or dummy environment. You can use some new CI/CD tools. Maybe spin up a container that is going to mimic the third party service. Some third parties will actually work with you to set up intricate networking and double netting so you can accomplish this testing. But if you're reliant on third parties, if you're using Salesforce or Workday or Oracle Cloud tied to your production environment, then think about how that affects your DR testing. And lastly, what does success look like for a test? What are the performance metrics? What's the speed at which the applications have to run? Where's your runbook for all the functions to be performed during DR? So these are some of the things to test about for testing. And then obviously you need to have a runbook around all of these. What does your runbook look like for failover, for failback, for testing? What are the things that you have to do? What are the things the application owners have to do, the third parties have to do? There's a lot there. There's a little screenshot from one of Webair's runbooks. So we've authored templates around all of these that we use when we onboard our own customers for disaster recovery. We always fill out the templates with them. We hand it to them even if it's part of their responsibility. But we have some pretty good templates around all of these, because as time goes on, we learn based on all of our customers and all of the different industries, and we have the templates, so we'd be more than happy to share those with you after the WebEx. So thinking about all those things that we went into, all the various infrastructure components, from a technical perspective, what's most challenging? And honestly, it always comes down to the network. As I said before, copying data and replicating data is the easy part. It's making the applications consumable to your end users at the DR site in the same way that they were at production, the most challenging component. We want to do that without having to call people and say, hey, please start using backup.site.com, or hey, please switch over to the secondary VPN. There are better ways to do that. And so from a networking perspective, the items to consider are A, you're going to need some sort of private connectivity between your production and DR site. You don't want it to have to flow over the public internet. VPN is fine, but to the extent that you can put in dedicated connectivity that is only there for replication, will reduce possible errors later. And you're probably thinking that connectivity takes 3 months to get installed, and dealing with vendors is a headache. And we'll show you some better ways on how you can get dedicated connectivity for this use case in a minute. So that's kind of par for the course. And then the consumption network, right? If your users are consuming your services over a VPLS or MPLS or an SD-WAN, obviously DR has to be a participant to that network. So going back to the types of failovers that we were talking about, if you're looking to simply protect against a full site failover, the networking becomes easier. If you can announce the same internal IPs into your internal network, MPLS network. If you're using if you have publicly facing subnets or IP addresses, the entire block can be advertised as well, which makes it simple. However, if you're looking for a per application or per VM failover capability, things can get more complicated. what you want to do is what the best practice recommends is to put each application in its own separate subnet, its own /27, its own VLAN. And so now you can fail over applications between sites, and your internal routing will be smart enough to route applications between the sites. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Many customers and companies have many applications within a specific block of IPs, C-class or VLAN, and so if you need to fail over one app and the apps need to speak to each other, that's not going to work. And so now you get into the business of doing dirty networking tricks like double natting and layer 2 stretches, which can be very dangerous to your production environment. And so that needs to be considered, and there are some tips and tricks that we can show you about how to make those better, about how to demarc the network and inject specific routes so that you don't have to go really dirty and you don't have to go really dangerous when you want to support per application failover. And we'll show you what one of those looks like in a minute. So yes, if you're running a publicly facing website, you can flip over BGP, but remember that's gonna flip over everything. You can certainly change DNS with low TTLs, or you can use a third-party DNS proxy service, which will redirect requests for your publicly facing host names to a secondary site automatically or act as a global load balancer, but those are very expensive. And so you have to really think about what your requirements are. The last thing is, if you are integrating to third-party networks, you have a private connection to your EMR provider or your customers or public clouds, obviously those need to be matched at DR. Those need to be considered as well. So what's a better way to interconnect the production DR sites? Well, you should certainly be looking at interconnection fabrics. These are sort of technologies and network providers who are providing network as a service in a software-defined capability where you can stand up connectivity between sites instantly. You can deploy a 1 gig, 10 gig circuit between data centers without having to go out and wait for last mile carriers and sign 5-year agreements and deal with headaches and cross connects. You can use a fabric, companies like Packet Fabric or Megaport or ECX or Epsilon, to stand up, scale up, scale it down connectivity. So maybe you start with a gig traffic, a gig connection between production and DR. You can ramp that up to 10 gigs during a failback event where you need that extra bandwidth to replicate back. And this is something that's very flexible and software defined. So that's one thing to look at from a sort of better networking capability. And the other thing to look at is talking about how do we make the applications consumable to the end users without having to touch the network. The network is always the challenge. When Webair, when we walk in to set up a disaster recovery implementation, there's always a network. It's always the network team that becomes a blocker to the IT team who wants to set up proper DR. And so one of the ways that we found to kind of alleviate that is we skip the physical network. We find ways to implement a disaster recovery strategy and plan that has nothing to do with the physical network at all. And the way to do that is to look at security tools. So there are all the new endpoint security types of tools that are deployed on end user devices. They're security tools, but they're actually networking tools under the hood, and they give you a global policy-based system where you can push rules to all of your users to say, hey, this user or this group or this office should no longer have access to that resource over here, or they shouldn't be able to access our internal cloud systems or whatever. You can build software-defined policies there which force the users to consume applications from different parts of your organization. So these security tools can really be used as workload mobility tools. One of the ones that we've integrated with is called AppGate, which has something called the software-defined perimeter, and we enable a rule in their controller. So when a specific application is failed over, the entire organization knows to consume the app from the DR site instead of production. And we never touch the routers, the network, the DNS, or any of that. And so if you're looking at these endpoint security tools, or SD-WAN controllers also have the similar capability, if you're looking at those types of new technologies, know that you can integrate them with your DR strategy so that you have this amazing failover, failback capability that means you can go and refresh your network, switch from Juniper to Cisco, change your network, whatever, and it does not affect your DR strategy. Next item to consider is, what are the dependencies? If you want to fail over workloads to the DR site, what needs to live there in order for them to function properly? Now, these come down to authentication type services, things like IPAM and other always-on infrastructures. You don't want to replicate those. You don't want to have to wait for 5 things to boot up before the application that's critically down that you're waiting for comes up. Those need to be ran always on, and they're so important and critical that you want to run them always on and bake them into your change control or synchronize them with production if you can. And so let's look at these. We have authentication services, Active Directory, LDAP, or maybe you're switching over to a cloud or SaaS-based third-party authentication system like an Okta or a Jump Cloud. Many of those are deploying caching VMs at customers' production sites. If you're doing that, you need to deploy the caching VM at DR as well. If you're using a centralized key management system, you want that running at DR always on. Two-factor, multi-factor, that needs to always be running. Anything regarding authentication must always be running at the DR site, must be clustered to production, or if they cannot be, has to be part of change control. Databases is an interesting topic too. Let's talk about those, going back to the capability of failing over individual applications. Well, what if you have a shared SQL server running at production? You have one SQL server, or even a one SQL server with 10 different databases. Each database is tied to an application, and one of your VMs is hit with ransomware, and you want to fail over just that one VM. Or are you failing over the VM and the SQL server that it needs to DR? Well, what about all the changes that are made to all the other databases at production that haven't been failed over? So that has to be considered. So you can obviously pull out that database, put it on its own SQL server, but now you're managing 10 SQL servers, or maybe you build an active, always-on cluster between the sites. There's not a right or wrong answer, but these are things you have to consider on a per application basis and for your environment. Other dependencies are going to be maybe tools like IPAM, like info blocks, if they're used as part of authentication. Obviously, DNS, DHCP, and any sort of vendor-provided VMs that are required. And then, another way to look at this too is, what does your production environment look like? Anything that's sitting on your local LAN at production, you need to account for at DR. If you have an IBM iSeries AIX box at production and it's in use by the other applications, that has to come over, and there are plenty of solutions to do that, even as a service solutions. What about direct storage into servers and VMs, like direct attach, iSCSI, or RDMs or NFS? So those are not going to be covered by your typical replication tools. Like if you're just installing a data mover, like a Veeam or a Zerto or Commvault, which are great tools, those are replication tools. Those are not going to cover all of your use cases around direct attached storage, fiber channel. And so there are other solutions that you want to employ for those. And then there's VDI, which is always a fun thing to consider for disaster recovery. And so unfortunately, there's no great way to just replicate an entire VDI environment from production to DR. There's always going to be an always-on component to that. If you're using NetScalers, you're going to want to run NetScalers at DR, which is great because it gives you this really great network capability to redirect users as needed. But when you think about VDI, you have to look at the technologies that you're planning on employing for VDI at production, because the more complicated you get with your VDI production environment, the more challenging it will be to replicate them at DR. Even if you look at something like VMware's Horizon Cloud Part architecture, that is an architecture. That is a recommended way that they're providing you with deploying components in different ways and managing and running operations so that you have a capability. It's not software. It's not a tool. It doesn't make your life easier at all. And so when you look at items like, are we going to use app volumes? Are we going to use linked clones? What type of desktops are we going to use? Those are all great types of decisions for your production, but each one of those has huge ramifications for how challenging it will be to build a proper disaster recovery for VDI. Of course, if your requirements are low and you just need some remote desktops at DR for people to RDP to, then that's super simple. But keep that in mind for VDI, and we've done a lot of those, so we've been through it. The next thing to consider is compliance. I think this is certainly getting a lot of play in the news and in the press. So what are your compliance requirements? Does your data need to be sovereign to the state? Maybe your law enforcement and evidence can't cross state lines. What about GDPR? And when you look at compliance, you have to think about who are you using for DR? Are you building it yourself? Are you using managed infrastructure? Are you using cloud? What are the restrictions? Maybe you're saying, hey, well, I'm just going to encrypt all my data at the DR site, so it doesn't really matter if it's encrypted. Then nobody is a party to the data, and so I don't have any liability for breach. Well, guess what? A lot of the replication tools out there have the data unencrypted because it needs to be unencrypted in order for it to read and write at production and DR. So whereas your data might be encrypted at rest, it will not be encrypted at the application level. And so if you're using a tool, if you're using a provider, there will be third parties to the data. So these are certainly things to consider. And also, if your company has built a strategy around security for the organization, around DLP, around network security, your DR has to sit behind that. Everything with DR has to be a good tenant on the existing security and network paradigm that you've built. And what about security? So one of the things that people don't think about is that security at the DR site needs to be just as good or better than production. It can't just be thought of, well, that's a DR site, it's not so important. Well, certainly not. If you have a copy of your most critical data and information and applications somewhere else, well, certainly you need to protect it. And so it has to be just as good as or better. If it wasn't, well, maybe someone's just attacking your production to force a failover, and now they have this nice new shiny point of exposure to attack you by. And so you have to consider that. What are the security vendors that you're going to be looking into in the future? Are you looking to bring in a third-party SOC or MSP provider who's going to deploy some sort of tap device or some sort of infrastructure at production so they have access? Well, is that supported at DR? If you're doing it in the cloud, will that even work? Can they even monitor that traffic? If you need to protect hybrid type of infrastructure, like half colo, half physical, half cloud, what is ramifications on security? So your decisions for security need to be in line with DR and vice versa. However, if you do it the right way, if you protect the DR site to be just as good or better than production, and if the security tools and vendors that you're looking at or speaking with are compatible with your DR infrastructure, then you actually end up with a very unique capability which enhances and improves your global security stance. Because now, if you do have a copy of all your critical data somewhere else at your DR site, and let's say it's seconds behind production, and you have your security tools there, well then you can use it. You can scan against the replica continuously, or maybe once a week. You can find exposure of vulnerabilities and security events on your application infrastructure stack much faster than before. Today, you might be doing once a year or twice a year intrusive vulnerability testing that has to be pre-planned and could potentially cause outages. That's fine. Keep doing that. You need to do that. But if you can also do it weekly against DR with this strategy, like I said, you'll reduce exposure from months to weeks. And the auditors and CISOs will be very happy if you can achieve something like this. And so think of the security at the DR site as not only a necessity or a requirement, but once you have it there, it's not only an investment in DR, it's an investment in security. So we've went through a lot here. We've talked about a lot of different considerations for what does a true DR strategy look like. And so now ask yourselves, what is your appetite for all that? Who would you like to take ownership and accountability for? Who's going to be in charge of the failover, the failback, and the testing? Who's going to be in charge of all the DR infrastructure, all of the hardware, software, licenses, compute, integration? Who's monitoring replication 24/7? Who's taking ownership of data breach and encryption at the DR site? And so there's a lot to own, and certainly there's companies that have very large IT teams that are more than comfortable owning all this, and there's also companies with very large IT teams that don't want to be on the hook, that don't want to be responsible, that have enough to handle, and they'd rather manage against an SLA and performance than infrastructure. And so think about that. And there's also many middle grounds here. So you can certainly use a managed disaster recovery as a service provider, Webair. We happen to be one of them. And in that case, you don't have to worry about any of these things, and you're just managing a vendor. You're managing an SLA. If the data is, let's say, 15 minutes behind, you're getting credits. If the applications don't perform well during testing, you have a contractual, legal, monetary avenue to hold a vendor accountable instead of having to deal with sort of internal folks. And so when you look at that ownership and accountability model, like I said, it's not all or nothing. You can certainly use a disaster recovery as a service provider, where all you're responsible for there on the right is to just test your applications and make sure with us and make sure your data looks valid. Or you have all the way over to the left, where you're building a second location. You're responsible for all the hardware and software and all that. And so if we compare the two extremes, we can certainly see that. If you do it yourself, everything is pretty much on you. But there, you see there's a question mark up there for infrastructure, for DIY, because let's be fair, maybe you have some older gear that you can use for the DR site. Maybe you're doing a production site refresh and you have infrastructure. Maybe it's not terribly difficult for you to do this. So one other thing to consider is that there's middle grounds. Webair, what we our stance with this is that we happen to be very flexible and customized. So for some of our customers, it's painful for them to go to a disaster recovery as a service provider because they've made so many investments into hardware and network and building up their stacks. And so sometimes we'll say, hey, co-locate your storage with us if it's compatible with what we use. We won't charge you for the storage, but we'll own other components. We'll own the management of the replication. We'll provide the SLA. We'll provide the compute. Maybe you're comfortable running your own network and you have your own routers. Well, great. You can co-locate that in front of the disaster recovery infrastructure, and you can own the network, same IP, same VLANs, but maybe your DRaaS provider, Webair, will own everything else. So don't just think all or nothing. There's some beautiful middle grounds to be had if you're looking at flexibility, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. So when we provide disaster recovery, the way that we do it is it's fully owned. We take full accountability for the failover process, for the failback process, for the testing. We give our customers 3 days out of every month to use the infrastructure for free for QA testing, patching, whatever, for the security testing, which I spoke about. So we encourage you to use the replica. So it's not just a cost center. We'll go down to up to a 15-minute RPO SLA, 1 hour RTO. It's all enterprise-grade hardware. You get guaranteed performance at the DR site, the same as production. And we provide you with portal access, which I'll show you in a minute. And then you also get all these great shiny security and compliance logos. And so we'll certainly provide you with our SOC 2 Type 2 audit, which is great because now instead of you having to fill out those pages and pages of auditor questionnaires, you send those to us and we literally fill them out for you, and we send you our SOC report, and we provide you with compliance for HIPAA, CGIS, GDPR, NYS, DFS, and EU, US Privacy Shield as well. And so we also sign BAAs for everything we do with healthcare and HIPAA, and so again, it's full ownership. Here's some nice screenshots of our portal. And so even though we are a fully managed provider, meaning if anything goes wrong or even during normal operations, you call us, you tell us, hey, we need to fail over, or hey, this is not working, or let's fail back, or let's test. We do provide managed quarterly testing included. That doesn't preclude you from being able to log into our portal and spin up your applications, your servers on demand at any time to test yourself whenever you want, or to use it for patching, testing, dev, QA, all that. You can console the VMs at the DR site. Certainly, you need to have console access. You don't want to be setting up WebEx sessions and screen shares with your provider, and when you have an event, you need immediate console access. You can ramp up the CPU, memory, disk resources of your failover VMs, because again, during an event, you can more than happy to call us, but you can just ramp it up as needed. And the way we bill for this is pretty simple. It's just simply based on the number of servers that we're replicating. And we do support VMware, Hyper-V, physical servers, IBM platforms, clouds. And so it's per server per month and the storage that those servers are consuming. That's it. Those are the main two cost metrics. And with those, you will get everything that I spoke about from the DR capabilities, all the hardware, software, compute, and all that. And then there'll be some costs regarding the always on. If you want it to run Active Directory always on and info blocks, and maybe your virtual Palo Alto, then there'll be some infrastructure fees. But again, it's completely customizable, and we try to make it super simple. There's no declaration fees. There's no data transfer fees. There's no operation fees. There's no hourly services. We're trying to, dumb it down to the least number of metrics. And here's some sample architectures to show you what some of this ends up looking like. This is one that we did for a global company who has infrastructure located throughout the world, about 8 different locations, but they have to conform to sovereignty requirements. And so they needed disaster recovery in each one of those countries as a target, which we set up. But at the same time, they do have shared resources between all of their global sites. So we built and provided them with disaster recovery in each country, with sovereignty in each country. We provided them with integration into their global MPLS network, and we also provided them with a private encrypted DR backbone network between the DR sites. So when one site fails over, it can reach the always-on shared infrastructure of the other sites. Here's one that we did for a financial organization, and the recovery infrastructure that you see there on the left is pretty typical of what we give our customers. When all of our customers are booting up on typically on UCS type of blades and on SSD storage, we do guarantee 1,000 IOPS disk performance for every terabyte that our customers are consuming. And you can see here with this customer, they're actually using Megaport already, and so we're replicating them over Megaport. We're also tying into their MPLS, and we also have connectivity for them to Charles River and Bloomberg at the DR site, which is typical for a financial type of customer, and they indeed as well as an always-on VDI implementation, which you see here. And so with VDI, that can be VDI is very customized, and so if you already have a part of your IT team who's managing VDI internally, well then great. Maybe we're gonna draw the line right below the VDI infrastructure. We'll do all the replication. We'll do all the networking. You manage your own VDI. Maybe you have an MSSP. Maybe you have an MSP or an IT vendor who's managing that component. That's great. Us as a provider will work side by side with your IT organization or your IT vendor, because all we're focused on is managed infrastructure for you. And the last thing we'll leave you with is, again, it's not black and white. It's not you're doing it yourself, or you're gonna go to a public cloud, which can be very challenging for DR. But many CIOs see the world going hybrid in the future. This is a poll that was done, which they had asked 5,000 CIOs, what do you see your production infrastructure looking like in 5 years? And the overwhelming majority, 80%, said it's going to be hybrid. Almost nobody said their infrastructure was only going to be on-prem, and almost no one said all their infrastructure was only going to be in the public cloud. And so if production is going hybrid, your production infrastructure looks like a mixing and matching of on-prem, of hosted private cloud, of colo, public cloud. How do you protect against that? How do you provide resiliency of the hybrid? And so at Webair, we really go back to our flexibility. We really go back to the ability to mix and match your own hardware, your own platforms, your own ownership for some applications, and mixed with our infrastructure, with our network capabilities, with our highly skilled engineers, so that together we can build you a disaster recovery strategy that will grow with your adoption of hybrid cloud, with your adoption of SaaS, so that we can live up to that. And so you're not thinking black and white, all or nothing, but we can build you a customized solution where maybe the disaster recovery, maybe it's air gaps in the public internet, maybe it's only privately connected to your internal IT organization. So definitely, we want to leave you with the thought of hybrid IT. So What should be your action plan? I mean, if you don't have a DR strategy, obviously we just threw a lot of information at you, but start with categorizing your applications. Make a list and try to attribute levels of risk tolerance to each. Which applications cannot afford any downtime at all? Which applications would be fine if they came up in 2 or 3 hours, and which might never need to come up? And then look at the top of the list, and for the most critical applications, what are your levels of exposure? Not only from an IT infrastructure perspective, from maybe a people perspective, a business perspective. And then once you've identified which applications are most critical, ask yourself, what is your appetite to take ownership of building the resiliency and BCDR plan and the IT infrastructure? And if you need some help and you're looking to make it someone else's headache, well, then maybe a managed ER provider, maybe like Webair, can help you with that. If you want to do it yourself, that's great too. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, remember, the decisions that you make in the future for your production environments, the vendors that you go to for SaaS or for software or for hosted VoIP, or for VDI, those are going to have tremendous ramifications for your resiliency considerations in the future. So it's better to start backwards. It's better to figure out what your DR is going to look like right now for your existing applications, build a strategy that you can then employ for your future decisions for hosted services and SaaS. And that is all that we have for you today. So thank you very much for attending. We will share the slides and make them public. You should get an email follow-up with the slides. And we're more than happy to speak to any of you on phone calls to show you some other reference architectures, maybe ones that were specific to your industry, share with you sample runbooks, or just have conversations on strategy. Even if you're not even considering a disaster recovery provider, I'm more than happy, and my team is more than happy to share with you what we've learned being on the trenches at the front line of building these disaster recovery implementations. I'm talking about the battle scars of what we've seen, the good, the bad, the ugly, and just giving you advice. Thank you very much, and hope to speak to you soon.